In 1873, a Prussian businessman dug up a mountain of gold in northwestern Turkey, buried inside a city that Western scholars had spent a century insisting was fiction. He believed a poem written 2,800 years earlier. Everyone else believed geography simply didn't work that way. Picture it: Heinrich Schliemann, a self-taught treasure hunter, with more money than training, tearing through a mound called Hisarlik, with picks and even dynamite, discarding entire layers of evidence that didn't match the Troy in his head, until his crew struck a hoard of gold jewelry. So extraordinary, he smuggled it out of the country, draped it over his young wife, and photographed her wearing what he called Priam's treasure. He had, in fact, found a real city, multiple cities actually, stacked on top of each other like rings inside a tree. What he hadn't found, and what no archaeologist has found since, is proof that any of them belonged to a king named Priam, a warrior named Achilles, or a soldier named Odysseus, who spent 10 years finding his way home. So here's the question this video actually asks. If the city is real, and the war might be real, why can't anyone prove the man was? Start with what's certain. Hisarlik sits on the coast of modern Turkey, near the mouth of the Dardanelles Strait, in almost the exact location Homer's Iliad places Troy. A British-American diplomat named Frank Calvert had identified the site years before Schliemann ever arrived, and convinced him to dig there. Schliemann took most of the credit, and most of the gold. Excavations since have revealed 9 major settlement layers, labeled Troy I through Troy IX, spanning roughly 3,600 BC to 500 AD, each one built on the ruins of the last. Schliemann's dynamite tore straight through the layer that actually matters. In his rush to reach an older city he wrongly believed was Homer's. Later, archaeologists, including Manfred Korfmann's team in the 1980s and 90s, identified the real candidate, Troy VIIa. This city doesn't just end. Its streets are scattered with unburied skeletons, embedded weapon points, and mud brick fused into slag by fire hot enough to melt stone. Korfmann's team also found something Schliemann never even looked for: a fortified lower city outside Troy's citadel walls, ringed by a defensive ditch cut into bedrock, large enough to house thousands of people. That single discovery matters, because it means Bronze Age Troy wasn't the small hilltop fort earlier scholars assumed. It was a real regional power, worth defending, worth besieging, and worth writing songs about for centuries after it burned. Radiocarbon and pottery dating place, Troy VIIa's destruction around 1180 B.C. Strikingly close to the fall of Troy, date ancient Greek writers, themselves calculated centuries before archaeology existed to check their math. Now the tension builds, because a burned city alone proves nothing. Cities burned constantly in the Bronze Age. What makes Troy VII different is what else was happening at that exact moment, across an entire region. This was the Bronze Age collapse. A catastrophe historian, Eric Klein, has described as one of the worst disasters in the ancient world. In roughly 50 years, the Hittite Empire disintegrated completely. The Mycenaean palace centers of Greece, the actual kingdoms that would have sent men like Odysseus to war, burned and were abandoned, never to be rebuilt at the same scale. Egypt barely survived repeated invasions by a mysterious coalition ancient texts call the Sea Peoples. Trade routes that had connected the entire eastern Mediterranean for centuries simply stopped functioning, almost overnight. Troy did not fall alone. Troy fell inside a regional collapse violent enough to end an entire civilization. This is also where the most famous detail in the whole story quietly falls apart. There is no archaeological trace of a wooden horse anywhere in any layer of Hisarlik. Some historians believe the horse was never a horse at all, that it's a folk memory of a siege engine or a poetic image built around Poseidon, the god the Greeks called the Earthshaker, patron of both horses and earthquakes. Troy sits in one of the most seismically active regions in the Mediterranean, And Troy VIIa shows damage patterns some archaeologists read as earthquake damage layered underneath the fire. If a quake cracked the walls open before an army ever needed to breach them, a horse built of wood may simply be how a war fought with luck, got turned into a war won with cleverness. And here's where the evidence gets genuinely strange. In the Hittite royal archives at Hattusa, in what is now central Turkey, clay tablets reference a city called Wilusa, ruled by a king called Alaksandu. Historian Trevor Bryce and others have argued Wilusa is very likely Homer's Ilios, an older name for Troy, and that Alaksandu bears an unmistakable resemblance to Alexandros, another name for Paris, the prince whose actions supposedly started the war. That is not proof of Achilles. It is not proof of the wooden horse. But it means Bronze Age government clerks, writing tax records and treaties with zero interest in poetry, independently recorded a real city sharing its identity with the one at the center of Homer's story. So line it up. A real city. A real destruction layer at the right time, defensible enough for a real siege. A real regional collapse, violent enough to justify a war fought over it. And now, a real name, sitting in a foreign government's own filing cabinet, 3,000 miles from where the poem was ever sung. What we do not have, anywhere in that pile of evidence, is Odysseus. No tablet, no inscription, no skeleton with his name carved beside it. Here's what the evidence simply cannot do. And it's the part serious historians stay careful about. The Iliad and the Odyssey were composed centuries after 1180 BC, carried forward orally through generations of poets, who compressed decades of half-remembered Bronze Age history into 2 poems, credited to a single blind man who may never have existed either. Homer, if he was even one person, was almost certainly working from fragments. Half-remembered kings, half-remembered wars, wrapped in gods and sea monsters, because that's what let a story survive. 300 years without ever being written down. Which means Odysseus may be built from one real soldier who actually made it home. Or 10 soldiers, their stories folded into one. Or none at all. Just the idea of a man clever enough to survive a war that ended an entire civilization, invented precisely because the real survivors never got to tell their own story. We may never know which. Silence. That's not a failure of archaeology. Archaeology found the city. It found the fire. It found the collapse. It even found the name, buried in a filing cabinet no poet ever touched. What it cannot do is dig up a person who only ever existed in the space between memory and myth.